What's going on, everybody? I just got finished listening to the Black Dahlia Murder's newest album, Verminous, which came out in April 17th this year. Um, this is my first album review on this channel, and it was requested by a buddy of mine to do this particular album because he's a huge Black Dahlia Murder fan, and because we're good friends, I figured I would do him the honors and review his suggested album for me. So, let's get right into it. I'm not a die-hard Black Dahlia Murder fan, admittedly. I do have one of their albums, Into the Everblack, which I believe came out 2013, if I remember correctly. I remember some friends of mine on that I knew through Facebook were all pretty hyped over the album, and I decided to check it out for myself. I really liked it, so I went and picked it up, and is it Into the Everblack or is it just Everblack? I think I said Everblack. Anyway, I went and bought that album. Really enjoyed it. Great melodic death metal. And it's funny, if you look at the Black Dahlia Murder's logo, you would think that they're like a deathcore band. It's one of the most misleading logos of all time. These dudes are a melodic death metal band through and through, and that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit with them before I get to the actual album review. If I could just talk about this for a minute or two. Here's the thing with the Black Dahlia Murder that fascinates me. From what little I have heard of them, and I've heard a handful of their albums, I've heard Nocturnal, Abysmal, Everblack, Nightbringer. I believe I listened to Nightbringers and this one. The Black Dahlia Murder are pretty much what would happen if you took a bunch of dudes, a bunch of death metal nerds, like death metal enthusiasts, right? It's like that episode of SpongeBob where, SpongeBob went to hang out with those jellyfishing enthusiasts. The Black Dahlia Murder almost feel like the death metal, the melodic death metal equivalent to that. But really, what I like about them is they come off as full-blown extreme metal enthusiasts, like death metal, black metal, you name it. I think I actually had their Facebook page liked for a while, and they would post extreme metal bands from all over, bands that I had never even heard of. I think I actually discovered Gorguts through them. I believe trying to think, also discovered Sentenced through them, just to name a few. Eucharist as well, or Eucharist are actually considered to be one of the first melodic death metal bands, so the Black Dahlia Murder probably wouldn't exist without them. And Sentenced, for that matter, who are also one of the first melodic death metal bands. But anyway, getting back to them, they come off as full-blown extreme metal enthusiasts. They come off as legitimate death metal fans, specifically, and I think that's why they're as good as they are and why they're as well liked by everybody as they are. That being said, let's get to the album. So, let's start off with the pros of this album first. The pros of this album are it's the Black Dahlia Murder in their purest form. It's them at their best. If you've listened to some of their earlier stuff, I for the life of me cannot remember the name of their first album right now, but the thing with the early Black Dahlia Murder records is if you listen to them, they really were, you could tell they were heavily influenced by At the Gates, who were another melodic death metal pioneer, interestingly enough. You could kind of tell on the first record with songs like Thy Horror Cosmic, there was a very clear At the Gates influence there, that kind of thrashy melodic death metal sound that they were known for. But going forward, pretty much from Nocturnal onward, when it got to that album, it seems like they had really hit their stride and actually found their sound. They had found this perfect mix between melody and brutality, and this album is no exception to that. It's actually, in my opinion, one of the better examples this band has put out to represent that kind of sound. I think Verminous does a fine job with this. The riffing on this record is nothing short of insane. The one thing I actually noticed about the riffs on this record is that there's a lot of black metal influence, and I say that because there are times where they go into that, blast beat style that you find black metal, that style that, you know, it's really well known for. You know, that really dissonant sounding harmony. You know, the dissonant sounding harmonized riffage that you find in black metal. And they've somehow managed to properly incorporate that into their death metal, their melodic death metal sound. So that was a big standout to me about this record, and I think it really adds to the overall overly dramatic riffs that you find in this record. That's one of the big things I noticed about the riffs on this record. They have this really gothic, over dramatic, you know, almost Edgar Allan Poe, H.P. Lovecraft kind of, you know, gothic atmosphere to them, which I'm sure is intentional, you know, considering that a lot of their lyrics are influenced by those particular writers, you know. And I mentioned Thy Horror Cosmic off their first album. That's a Lovecraftian horror song. You know, it's pretty freaking obvious who their literary influences are, and I think it really shows on these riffs. I think it really adds to the album, though, especially considering the fact that the theme of this album is that it's very, you know, it's about rats. It's about, you know, the dark, cavernous aspects of the world of horror, you know, which is another common trope in gothic horror. You know, these dark caverns, rats going through the tunnels, bodies decaying. That's the biggest thing that sticks out to me about this particular record, and this is what I like the most about the Black Dahlia Murder, is that melodic death metal, if you're familiar with it, if you listen to bands like In Flames, At the Gates, Sentenced, and trying to think of another one, tip of my tongue, Amon Amarth, who are not, you know, a pioneering band, but they are a melodic death metal band. But in this case, I'll stick with In Flames and Amon Amarth because they are the best example of this. Melodic death metal has a very graceful sound. It's not like your standard run-of-the-mill death metal. It's not, you know, extreme, dark, dissonant riffs. It's not these ominous, you know, devilish-sounding riffs. It actually has this level of grace to it. You know, almost like what Iron Maiden did in the 80s with their, you know, properly harmonized riffs, you know, sounding perfectly in key. It's something that really sticks out to me about melodic death metal. I think it's what separates it from other genres in extreme metal. And the Black Dahlia Murder somehow managed to do that, but also mix in these really extreme, pummeling riffs. And there's a lot of that on Verminous. And I think it blends well with the black metal influence that they have, but also keeps them rooted in that death metal, melodic death metal territory. It really, I think, is the highlight of this record for me personally. As far as, you know, the record overall, it's the highlight. Now let's talk about Trevor Sternad's vocals. I'm fairly certain I said his last name wrong. I think it's Sternad. He's great as usual. He's always been great. He is probably the most dynamic vocalist in death metal. Maybe in extreme metal altogether. He can do these freaking high-ass black metal-like shrieks and then go down to these extremely guttural, you know, George Corpse Grinder Fisher, Chris Barnes, Chuck Schuldiner, guttural vocals. And he does it with such finesse and ease. He can go from high-pitched shrieking to those gutturals without even trying. It's almost like he's putting no effort into it, and there's a lot of that on this album. Throughout the entire album, actually, he is just, you know, constantly going back and forth. It's very manic. It's almost psychotic. And another standout to me on the later tracks on the album, there are these certain verses in the songs where he'll not really be doing these shrieks, but not really be doing these gutturals either. It's almost like he's, you know, legit, not even yelling. He's talking in this extremely aggressive tone. It's almost like he's speaking. And the aggression in his voice, you know, you want to call it yelling, but it's not. He's speaking like a psychopath, you know what I mean? Like this really psychotic person who's about to have a breakdown, is just, you know, about to explode, you know, spit coming out of his mouth. It's one of the really interesting things about this record, actually. It was one of the biggest standouts to me when I was listening to it. I was like, that's very different. You don't usually hear stuff like this in death metal. But, you know, that's one of the things that makes the Black Dahlia Murder stick out. And I think it's something worth paying attention to, because I think it really does add quite a lot to a genre that, as at times, tends to be very um, formulaic, which is kind of a big problem in extreme music. Um, it's a little unfortunate, but it's nice to see that people like Trevor Sternad actually go out of their way to try and add some dynamics to extreme metal by doing stuff like that. It's a little thing, but it helps a lot. It's kind of like seasoning, almost like seasoning a steak. You don't think it helps all that much, but it really does. It actually gives it a lot of flavor. And I do think this album had a really good opener and a really good closer, which I think is important for an album. If you're gonna have like an album, you know, have a starting point and an ending point, the starting point and ending point should be on the same level. And this album does a fine job with that. Now for some cons about this album. It's from Nocturnal onward, I think the Black Dahlia Murder really settled into a particular sound. You know, this mix of brutality with melody. This album is a pretty standard record from them at this point, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but at the same time, I kind of want to see them go into something a bit more experimental. I think they are kind of at a point now, though, where they have a sound. They've had this sound for, you know, a good over a decade now. They don't really need to try, but it does. Part of me did want something to stick out from this record, and I think that was kind of one of the problems that I had with this album overall. Is the riff, as good as it was, as good a record as it was, a lot of the songs really do have a similar formula. You know, there's like black metal influence throughout the entire album, which is cool, but I wouldn't mind seeing songs with just black metal influence only, and songs that feel straightforward, more like melodic death metal. You know, kind of like some of the stuff you'd find on Nocturnal. It's just, it does kind of give the songs a little bit, it does blur the songs a little bit. It almost feels like they're kind of mushed into each other a little bit. Really, these cons aren't meant to be, you know, big negatives for this record, but I wish it had stuck out a little bit more. I do think it could have. It just kind of sucks that there's not more of a spice to the record. I guess it just feels like it's pretty much the Black Dahlia Murder doing what they do best. I do wish they had done a little more. That being said, it's still a very good album, and I would totally recommend it. The pros outweigh the cons by quite a bit. It's still a worthy enough album to listen to, and I think it's an album that is definitely worthy enough for a few repeated listens. Overall, if you like the Black Dahlia Murder, you'll love this album. If you love the Black Dahlia Murder, actually, then you'll want to marry this album, because it's the Black Dahlia Murder doing what they do best, mixing melodic death metal with a much more brutal, you know, dynamic that you usually don't find in a lot of melodic death metal bands. Like I said, it's a very graceful genre, despite being a subgenre of extreme music. But the Black Dahlia Murder are a great example of showing that you can still be brutal, even though you have more melody than your standard run-of-the-mill death metal band. And this is another thing I should point out about the Black Dahlia Murder. The best way I could describe them is like they're a hybrid between At the Gates and Dissection. You know, they have the kind of thrashy, you know, pummeling riffs that At the Gates were known for, especially during the Terminal Spirit Disease, Slaughter of the Soul era. But they also mix the kind of melody that you would find on Storm of the Light's Bane by Dissection. And I think it shows on this album, on Verminous, more than it shows on any of their previous records. So if there's one thing to really love about this record, it's that. and I would strongly recommend this album to pretty much anybody who loves extreme metal in general. So some tracks that were highlights for me were the opener, Verminous. Removal of the Oaken State had some great melodies on it. The Leather Apron Scorn, again, great melodies. How Very Dead, which transitions into the Wereworm's Feast. Out of all the songs that have the most black metal influence on this record, those two have the most black metal influence. And if you're a fan of that particular genre, these two songs are for you. And Dawn of the Rats was an excellent closer, had a very melancholic vibe to it. I really liked that. And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I think it's a great album, a solid record, and the grade I'm going to give it is an 8.5 out of 10. That's my first review. I hope you guys like it. If you disagree with me, let me know in the comments. If you agree with me, great. But if you disagree with me, I really want to hear some counterpoints, because, you know, maybe it'll give me a different perspective on this record. But like I said, it's still a solid record, and I believe everybody should check it out. This is Riff Priest Reviews, signing out.